I didn't show up to my own wedding, and honestly, I'd make the same choice again. My fiancée thought she could ambush me with the two people I've spent 14 years avoiding, and somehow that was supposed to be a gift. Let me explain how a surprise that was meant to heal a family ended up destroying a relationship instead. I'm Alex, 32 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought I was going to marry the love of my life. Emily and I had been together for 4 years, and everything felt right until she decided my trauma was something she could fix without my permission. This is the story of how I walked away from the altar before I even got there, and why I don't regret it for a second. The thing about cutting off your parents is that people never really get it until you spell it out for them, and even then they think you're exaggerating. I haven't spoken to my mom or dad since I was 18, and I had very good reasons for that decision. Growing up in that house meant walking on eggshells every single day, never knowing what would set them off, constantly being told I was worthless or stupid or a disappointment. My dad had a temper that could flip like a switch, and my mom enabled every bit of it while adding her own brand of emotional damage to the mix. By the time I graduated high school, I knew I had two choices: stay and let them destroy me completely, or leave and build a life where I actually mattered. I chose myself, and I've never looked back. When I met Emily 4 years ago, I was upfront about my family situation from the start. I told her my parents weren't in my life, that it wasn't up for discussion, and that I had no intention of ever reconnecting with them. She said she understood, that everyone has complicated family dynamics, and that she respected my boundaries. I thought that was the end of it. Wedding planning started about 8 months before the big day, and one of the first conversations we had was about the guest list. I sat Emily down at our kitchen table, and I made something crystal clear. My parents are not invited to this wedding. This is non-negotiable. I said it calmly but firmly, looking her straight in the eyes so she'd know I meant every word. She blinked a few times like she was surprised, and then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me it was my wedding too, that she would never invite anyone who made me uncomfortable, and that we were building our own family now. I believed her completely. Her mom, Susan, asked me about it a week later when we were having dinner at her place, wondering if maybe my parents might want to be involved somehow. I shut that down immediately, telling her politely but firmly that they wouldn't be there and that chapter of my life was closed. Susan looked at Emily, then back at me, and said she understood. Emily backed me up in that moment, telling her mom that she supported my decision 100%. Emily also has a younger sister named Rachel who was supposed to be one of the bridesmaids, and even she seemed to get that some family situations are just too broken to fix. Everything seemed fine, and I let myself relax into the wedding preparations, thinking we were on the same page about everything that mattered. The first hint that something was wrong came exactly 1 week before the wedding, on a Monday afternoon. I came home from work early and heard Emily on the phone in our bedroom with the door half closed. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was just grabbing a water from the kitchen when I caught part of what she was saying. "He doesn't know yet. It's supposed to be a surprise," she said in that excited whisper voice people use when they're planning something they think is clever. My stomach dropped immediately, because in the context of our wedding there was only one surprise I could think of that would require secrecy. I stood there frozen in the hallway trying to convince myself I was paranoid, that maybe she was talking about some other detail like a special song or a cake flavor. But deep down I already knew, and the knowing felt like ice water in my veins. She came out of the bedroom a minute later and nearly jumped when she saw me standing there. I asked her what surprise she was talking about, and she got this deer in headlights look that told me everything before she even opened her mouth. The conversation that followed is burned into my memory forever. Emily tried to laugh it off at first, saying it was nothing important, just some small detail she wanted to keep special. I didn't let her deflect. I asked again what surprise she meant, and this time my voice had an edge to it that made her realize I wasn't going to drop it. She took a deep breath, and then she just said it. She'd invited my parents. The words hung in the air between us like a grenade that hadn't exploded yet. I stared at her, genuinely not sure if I'd heard her correctly, and then I asked her to repeat herself. She did, and this time she added that she thought it would be beautiful, that every person deserves to have their family at their wedding, that maybe seeing me happy and successful would help heal old wounds. I felt my hands start shaking, not from sadness but from pure rage. I reminded her that I'd specifically told her they were not welcome, that this wasn't up for discussion, that I'd made my boundaries crystal clear from day one. She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, and that's when she started with the justifications. She said she'd been talking to her mom about it for weeks, that they both felt like family was too important to throw away, that she wanted to give me the gift of reconciliation. She actually used the word gift, like ambushing me with my abusers was some kind of generous gesture. I told her she had no right to make that decision, that she'd betrayed my trust in the worst possible way, and that I needed her to uninvite them immediately. Emily started crying then, saying she'd already confirmed everything with them weeks ago, that they were excited to come, that uninviting them now would be cruel. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was more concerned about the feelings of two people who'd made my childhood miserable than she was about the person she was supposed to marry. I gave her an ultimatum right there in our living room. If they show up to that wedding, I won't. She looked at me like I'd slapped her, and she asked if I was seriously threatening to leave her at the altar over this. I wasn't threatening anything. I was making a promise. I told her she could have them there, or she could have me, but she couldn't have both. She kept crying and saying I was being unreasonable, that I was ruining everything, that she'd only done this because she loved me. That last part made me laugh, an ugly bitter sound that didn't feel like it came from me. Love doesn't mean trampling someone's boundaries and calling it a surprise, I said, and those were the last words I spoke to her before I grabbed my keys and walked out. I drove straight to my best man Mark's apartment and told him I needed a place to crash for a while. He took one look at my face and didn't ask questions, just handed me a beer and pointed to his couch. At that point, I honestly didn't know if I was still getting married. That first night at Mark's place, I didn't sleep at all. I just sat on his couch staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Emily over and over in my head, trying to figure out how someone who claimed to love me could do something so fundamentally wrong. Mark didn't push me to talk about it right away. He just made coffee in the morning and sat across from me waiting until I was ready. When I finally told him what happened, his face went through about 5 different expressions before he settled on pure disbelief. He asked if Emily had lost her mind, and honestly, I was wondering the same thing. This wasn't some small disagreement about wedding colors or seating arrangements. This was her deciding that my clearly stated boundaries didn't matter because she thought she knew better. The more I sat with it, the angrier I got, not just at what she'd done, but at the calculation behind it. She hadn't told me because she knew I'd say no, and she'd waited until 1 week before the wedding because she thought I'd be too invested to back out. My phone started going off around mid-morning on Monday with texts and calls from Emily. At first they were apologies, long rambling messages about how she understood she'd made a mistake and how sorry she was for going behind my back. I read them but didn't respond, and that seemed to make her panic. By early afternoon, the messages shifted to justifications, saying her mom had convinced her it was the right thing to do, that family should be together during important moments, that she truly believed seeing me successful and happy might change my parents somehow. I read every message and felt my resolve getting stronger with each one because none of them addressed the actual problem. She wasn't sorry for violating my trust. She was sorry I was upset about it. There's a huge difference between those two things, and it told me everything I needed to know about how she viewed this situation. Monday evening, her messages took on a different tone entirely, getting defensive and almost angry, saying I was overreacting and being dramatic, that lots of people have complicated relationships with their parents and still include them in major life events. That message in particular made me want to throw my phone across the room because she was comparing my situation to normal family tension, like my parents had just been a bit strict or occasionally annoying. The pattern continued for the next 3 days. Tuesday brought more apologies mixed with guilt trips about how much money had been spent and how many people were expecting a wedding. Wednesday, she tried a different approach, sending me photos from our relationship, reminding me of good times we'd had, basically trying to emotionally manipulate me into compliance. Thursday morning, she enlisted her sister Rachel to text me, asking if I was okay and saying Emily was devastated. I finally responded to Rachel, not because I wanted to engage, but because she'd always been kind to me and deserved an explanation. I told her that Emily had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that this wasn't about cold feet or wedding jitters. It was about fundamental trust and respect. Rachel wrote back saying she understood, that she'd tried to talk Emily out of the surprise but had been shut down, and that she was sorry this was happening. At least someone in that family got it. Mark asked me multiple times over those days what I was going to do, and I told him honestly that I was still deciding. Part of me wanted to believe this was just a massive error in judgment, that Emily would come to her senses and somehow fix it, that we could move past this if she truly understood how badly she'd messed up. But another part of me, the part that had survived 18 years with my parents, was screaming that this was a red flag I couldn't ignore. The thing about boundaries is that they only work if people respect them, and Emily had shown me that when it came down to it, she thought her feelings and her family's opinions mattered more than my explicit needs. I kept thinking about what marriage to her would look like, whether I'd spend the rest of my life wondering when she'd decide to override my decisions again for my own good. Trust is everything in a relationship, and she'd shattered mine in one stupid selfish move that she'd somehow convinced herself was an act of love. The wedding was supposed to be on a Friday afternoon at a venue about 30 minutes outside the city. Thursday night around 11, Emily sent me one final text that was different from all the others. "Please just come tomorrow. We can figure everything else out after," she wrote, and I realized that was her strategy all along. She thought if she could just get me to that altar, surrounded by all our friends and family and my parents, I wouldn't be able to walk away. She was betting on my discomfort with public confrontation, betting that I'd swallow my anger and go through with it rather than cause a scene. That text was what made my decision final, because it showed me she still didn't get it. This wasn't about the wedding or the guests or avoiding embarrassment. This was about the fact that I couldn't marry someone who thought my trauma was a problem to fix without my consent. I turned off my phone around midnight and told Mark I wasn't going. And he just nodded like he'd been expecting that answer all along. Friday morning felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream where nothing was quite solid. I woke up on Mark's couch knowing that right now Emily was probably getting her hair done, that in a few hours she'd be putting on her dress, that guests were already starting to arrive at the venue. I felt guilty for about 10 seconds before I remembered why I wasn't there, and then the guilt transformed into something closer to grief. This should have been one of the happiest days of my life, and instead I was hiding in my best friend's apartment, trying not to think about what was happening without me. Mark asked if I was sure about my decision, not because he doubted me, but because he wanted to make absolutely certain I wouldn't regret it later. I told him I was sure, that I'd rather deal with the fallout of a canceled wedding than spend my life with someone I couldn't trust. He respected that, and we spent the afternoon watching movies and pretending this was just a normal day off work. I found out later what happened at the venue, pieced together from messages Mark got from other groomsmen and some posts people made online before they realized the full situation. Guests started arriving around 2 in the afternoon, everyone dressed up and excited, completely unaware that the groom wasn't coming. Emily was in the bridal suite getting ready with Rachel and her bridesmaids, and apparently, she kept asking if anyone had heard from me, getting more anxious as time went on. My parents showed up right on schedule, my dad in a suit I'd never seen before, and my mom wearing what people described as a very elaborate dress. They seemed thrilled to be there according to witnesses, smiling and greeting Emily's family like they were honored guests instead of uninvited crashers. The ceremony was supposed to start at 3 o'clock, and by 2:45 people were getting restless, murmuring about where I might be. Mark had texted me one last time right before he was supposed to walk down the aisle, one final chance to change my mind, but my phone was off, and even if it hadn't been, my answer would have stayed the same. 3 o'clock came and went with no groom. Emily sent Rachel out to check if I was in the parking lot, or maybe having some kind of crisis in my car. By 3:15, the murmuring had turned into full conversations, people pulling out their phones and texting each other asking what was going on. At 3:30, the wedding coordinator went into the bridal suite, and I can only imagine what that conversation was like, Emily realizing that I'd meant what I said, that I actually wasn't coming. The wedding was officially called off around 3:45, and guests were told there had been an emergency and everyone should go home. Emily's family was apparently mortified. Her mom, Susan, kept trying to call my phone, which went straight to voicemail, and my parents were absolutely furious. According to Mark, my dad made a huge scene in the parking lot, yelling about disrespect and embarrassment, saying I'd always been an ungrateful child, and this proved it. Several people tried to calm him down, but he just got louder, and eventually someone from the venue had to escort him to his car. He left me a voicemail during all of this that I didn't listen to until much later, and hearing that voicemail reminded me why I cut them off in the first place. I waited until Saturday evening to listen to the voicemail my dad left, partly because I needed to mentally prepare myself, and partly because I already knew it would be bad. Mark offered to listen to it first as a buffer, but I told him this was something I needed to face myself. I put my phone on speaker and hit play, and within the first 5 seconds I was transported right back to being a kid in that house. My dad's voice was pure rage, that specific tone he used when he wanted to make sure you understood how worthless you were. He called me every name he could think of, said I'd humiliated him and my mother in front of strangers, said I'd always been a disappointment, and this stunt proved I'd never amount to anything. He went on for almost 2 minutes, his voice getting louder and more vicious, and then right at the end, he said something that actually made me laugh. He told me I'd better apologize to him and my mother for this disrespect, that I owed them that much after everything they'd done for me. The irony of him demanding an apology while leaving a voicemail like that wasn't lost on me, and I saved the recording because I knew it might be useful later. Sunday morning, I finally turned my phone back on fully and found 63 missed calls and over 100 text messages. Most were from Emily, some from her mom Susan, a few from various relatives and friends asking what happened. I ignored all of them except one from Mark asking if I was still alive, to which I responded that I was fine and would explain everything later. Then I did something I probably should have done years ago. I sent the voicemail recording to Emily with a single line of text explaining that this was why those people weren't welcome in my life. I didn't expect it to change anything, but I wanted her to hear with her own ears what I'd been trying to protect myself from. She didn't respond right away, and I figured she was either too angry to reply or had finally realized she didn't have any moral high ground to stand on. The silence was almost worse than the constant messages had been because it meant she was actually thinking instead of just reacting. Emily finally called me Monday afternoon, and her voice sounded completely different than it had in any of our previous conversations. She was quiet, almost timid, and she started by saying she'd listened to the voicemail 3 times because she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I had no idea it was that bad, she said, and I could tell she was crying. She apologized for not understanding, for thinking she could fix something she didn't fully comprehend, for putting her vision of a perfect family reunion above my safety and well-being. It was the first real apology I'd gotten from her, the first time she'd acknowledged that she'd been fundamentally wrong instead of just sorry I was upset. But here's the thing about apologies, they don't erase what happened. I told her I appreciated her finally understanding, but that the damage was done. Trust isn't something you can just apologize back into existence, especially when it's been broken this badly. She asked if we could meet in person to talk, and after some hesitation I agreed because I figured we both deserved actual closure rather than just ending things over the phone. Before I could meet with Emily, her mom Susan called me on Tuesday morning. I almost didn't answer because I wasn't in the mood for another lecture about the importance of family, but something made me pick up. Susan started the conversation by defending the surprise, saying that every child should have their parents at their wedding regardless of past issues, that forgiveness was important, that holding grudges only hurt the person doing the holding. I listened to her entire speech without interrupting, and when she finally paused for breath, I asked her a simple question. I asked if she'd want her daughter to marry someone whose parents had spent 18 years tearing her down, making her feel worthless, creating an environment where she never felt safe or valued. Susan went quiet, and I could practically hear her trying to figure out how to respond. Then I told her about specific incidents from my childhood, not the worst ones because those were too painful to share, but enough to paint a clear picture of what my normal had been. I explained that my dad's temper wasn't just occasional anger. It was a constant presence that shaped every moment of every day. I told her my mom had never once stood up for me, had actively participated in making me feel like I deserved the treatment I got. By the time I finished talking, Susan was silent, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was shaky. She said she hadn't known, that Emily had told her I was estranged from my parents, but hadn't explained the severity of it, that if she'd understood, she would never have encouraged the surprise. I told her I appreciated that, but it didn't change the fact that her daughter had made a choice that showed she valued other people's opinions more than my explicitly stated boundaries. Emily and I met at a coffee shop on Wednesday afternoon, neutral territory where neither of us had home field advantage. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept since the wedding that wasn't, and she'd clearly been crying recently. We sat down across from each other, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Finally she spoke, telling me she understood now why I'd made the choice I did, that listening to that voicemail had opened her eyes to things she'd been willfully blind to before. She said her mom had called her after our conversation and had been horrified by the details I'd shared, that her whole family now understood this wasn't about me being stubborn or unforgiving. I nodded and thanked her for finally getting it. But then I had to ask the question that had been eating at me all week. Why hadn't she just believed me in the first place? Why did she need proof before my word was enough? She didn't have a good answer for that, just said she'd thought she was helping, that she'd genuinely believed love could heal anything if people just tried hard enough. We talked for over 2 hours about everything, the relationship, the wedding, the future. I told her I couldn't marry her, not after this, not when I'd spent the last week questioning every decision we'd ever made together. She started crying again and asked if I was breaking up with her, and I realized I didn't actually know the answer to that question. What I knew was that I wasn't ready to marry someone I couldn't trust, that the foundation we'd built over 4 years had massive cracks in it now. I need time, I told her, and I could see the hope flash across her face before I clarified what I meant. I explained that we needed to take a real pause, not just a few days to cool off, but actual separation where we both figured out if this relationship was something that could be saved. I wasn't ready to throw away 4 years without really thinking about it, but I also couldn't pretend nothing had happened. She asked what a pause would look like, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, that we'd be living separately and not really together, but not completely broken up either. She nodded and said she understood, that she'd do whatever it took to rebuild my trust if I was willing to eventually let her try. We left the coffee shop without any solid answers, just an agreement that we'd figure things out as we went. Emily went back to the apartment we'd shared, and I stayed at Mark's place while I looked for my own spot. Over the next few weeks, we texted occasionally, surface-level stuff about how we were doing, nothing deep or meaningful. I spent a lot of time thinking about whether I'd made the right choice, whether walking away from the altar had been brave or cowardly, whether a relationship could recover from something like this. Some days I thought maybe eventually we could find our way back to each other, that if she really understood what she'd done wrong, and if I could learn to trust her again, we might have a chance. Other days I was certain that what she'd done was unforgivable, that the person who truly loved me wouldn't have put me in that position regardless of their good intentions. The truth is I still don't have all the answers, and I'm not sure I will for a long time. Right now, Emily and I are living separate lives, both trying to figure out who we are outside of the relationship we thought would last forever. Maybe someday I'll post an update telling you we worked through it and found our way back to each other. Maybe I'll tell you we officially ended things and moved on with different people. But for now, all I can say is that sometimes walking away from the altar is the only way to protect yourself, and sometimes the person you love most is the person who hurts you deepest. I don't regret my choice, even on the days when I miss her so much it physically hurts, because I know that marrying her that day would have meant sacrificing the boundaries I'd spent 14 years building. No relationship is worth losing yourself, no matter how much you love the other person. That's what I learned from all of this, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.